Hey, welcome back. Today we're here to talk about evolution and how evolution affects populations. So, one thing to note is that populations, not individuals, evolve. An individual in its one lifetime cannot evolve. So, one organism within its lifetime cannot evolve a new phenotype in response to its environment. That process is going to take the act of natural selection, acting on the entire population over a long period of time. So, one individual does not evolve, a population evolves over time. So the genetic makeup in the population changes, and traits that help organisms are going to become more frequent. So one organism doesn't change, the entire population will change over time based on traits being beneficial and being passed on. That will lead to change over time. Now, some vocab that we will need for this specific topic is first, what is a population? So, a population is a localized group of individuals that can breed with one another. Now, these individuals are going to be of the same species. So, a population is a group of organisms, all of the same species, that breed with one another. Next, you will need to know that the gene pool is the collection of alleles in that population. So certain forms of a trait are going to be more common, and that means that more individuals are going to carry those alleles. And the gene pool will be the collection of different alleles in a population. Some will be more frequent than others. Now, the allele frequency is the percentage of any particular allele in the gene pool. So how many capital A's versus how many lowercase a's there are in a population. So the gene pool would be the collection of different alleles in a population. So the gene pool for hair color would be all the different hair colors: brown, red, black, blonde, dirty blonde, all the different hair colors, whatever you could think of. And the allele frequency would be the frequency of alleles for brown hair, the frequency of alleles for blonde hair. That would be allele frequency. And then our last one is genetic equilibrium. And this is the frequency of alleles in a population when it remains the same over many generations. So genetic equilibrium is the frequency of alleles in a population when the population remains the same over many generations. So equilibrium is reached only when a population maintains the same rate of allele frequency for many generations. All right, so evolution of a population. Evolution itself is change over time. So evolution is the change of allele frequencies in a population over time. And there's going to be a few different things that are going to contribute to this. Things that are going to contribute to evolution over time are mutations, gene flow. We're going to talk about each individually after we list them out. Then there's going to be non-random mating, population size, and then selection. So we're going to start off with these factors, again, factors that contribute to evolution of a population. So the first one that contributes to evolution of a population are mutations, and mutations are changes in an organism's DNA. So if there is a mutation, it's going to lead to a new DNA sequence, which could lead to a new amino acid, a new protein, and then possibly a new structure and function. Now, mutations can vary. Some mutations are lethal, meaning that they're deadly. So some mutations will lead to death of that particular mutation very quickly. And then some of them result in diversity or variation, and that variation is going to be useful in the population because it could be beneficial. So if that mutation is one that leads to a useful variation, it's going to become beneficial and it'll become more popular and it'll incorporate itself into the gene pool over time. So mutations can lead to one of two things: either something very lethal, in which case that particular mutation will just die out, or it could lead to some type of useful diversity, useful variation, and then it will increase in frequency over time. Now, the second thing that can lead to evolution of a population is gene flow. So gene flow happens due to movement of individuals, and therefore their genes in and out of a population. So an example of this would be seed and pollen distribution by wind and insects. So wind or insects can take pollen from one location and move it way to another location. And that causes possibly new alleles to be moved into another population. I spelled that wrong. So that can happen through insects and pollination, moving pollen and alleles from one population to another, or it could happen most typically toward the migration of animals. So if an animal migrates from one area to another, they're taking their DNA with them. And if their DNA contains a new allele that the other population doesn't have, it's going to change that population. It's introducing something new. So it's going to cause genetic mixing across regions, and then therefore it's going to reduce differences between the populations. So it takes one trait that may not exist in the other population and move it over, and then you're going to have new alleles being introduced, and that can lead to change over periods of time. The next thing that can lead to evolution is non-random mating, and that's also known as sexual selection. So sexual selection is going to, you typically see it in species of animals that are going to have some type of huge display to attract a mate. So we have many examples here. Here, the peacock, the male peacock, has beautiful array of tail feathers to attract a mate. Birds, some male birds are going to have like this one has a very beautiful, radiant, deep red chest to attract females. Deer populations, males have big antlers so they can bite for a mate. So let's just do an example. So let's just go with a bird. All birds are different. It depends on the species. Let's say we have a bird species that does a dance to attract a mate. Many bird species will do some type of dance to attract their mate, and they have to do a really good dance. Like the male birds need to do a very perfect, beautiful dance to attract the females to mate with them. So this is non-random mating because the males have to have a good dance, or they have to have beautiful tail feathers, or they have to have the biggest antlers, or they have to do the right, call or sing the right tune or something. So it's non-random, and that's going to lead to change over time because eventually you're going to have male peacocks that have bigger and better and more beautiful tails, because the only ones that are being mated with are the ones that have the big, beautiful tails. And all the male birds that have dull tails, they're not having babies. because they're not being chosen by the females, meaning eventually having a dull tail is going to die out in that population. Very similar things for birds. Some birds, like the cardinal, there are cardinals around here. The male cardinal is going to be the ones that are the deepest red are going to be the male cardinals, and the females are more bland. And that's because over time, females choose the most beautiful red cardinal to mate with. Therefore, most of the cardinals, the male cardinals, are going to be that deep, beautiful red. So that's going to lead to changes over time. The next one is population size. Now, population size can change due to different events that may happen to a population. And it's going to greatly affect any small population. So if a population is small, and let's say there's a certain allele that only a few individuals have, if a lot of organisms die, it's going to greatly change the frequency of alleles in that population. So meaning if we have a small population of birds and only 10% of them have a certain trait, and something happens and half of the population dies, it could easily wipe out that entire trait. So it's going to, any type of chance event, typically natural disasters, are going to greatly affect small populations. One example of this is called the founder effect, and it's when a small group of organisms is going to splinter off or split off from the rest of the organisms, and they're going to start their own little area. But when that happens, if some type of event happens to that small group, it can completely change their whole dynamic, their whole gene pool. One thing that can happen is called a bottleneck effect, and this is when a large population is drastically reduced by a disaster. So an example would be like a natural disaster, some type of famine, loss of habitat, and these are caused by chance events, and it causes great loss from the gene pool, and it's not due to fitness. So here, the easiest way to show it is by looking here at this bottle, I guess. Let's look at the bottle and the marbles that are in the bottle. This would be the gene pool. We have a mix of blue, yellow, red. Yep, I see blue, yellow, and red. And all mixed together. And it looks like red is the least common. If there's some type of event happens, a bottleneck event, let's say there was a natural disaster, a massive hurricane rolls through, and there's some type of bottleneck event, a ton of organisms die. And here are the ones that survive the event. So here are the ones that survive. The few that survive are going to reproduce, and very, very quickly, within a generation or two, we went from this very diverse initial population to the much less diverse population over here, just because of one chance event. An example of this has actually happened to cheetahs. Cheetahs share a very small number of alleles. There's less than 1% diversity amongst cheetahs. And so it's kind of like all cheetahs are identical twins to one another. They have very, very, very little diversity. And the reason that this happened is because of two bottlenecks. The first bottleneck that happened to cheetahs was back in the Ice Age, where a lot of organisms died. And then in the last 100 years has been another bottleneck caused by poaching, as well as loss of habitat. And this is one place where I can intervene and say, cheetah diversity is drastically low due to two bottleneck events. One of them was natural and we had no control over, and that was the Ice Age. However, one is man-made. Poaching and loss of habitat, that's due to human activity. That did not have to happen to the cheetahs. So we're just think about the things that you do every day and how it can affect organisms around you. Because cheetahs could be more diverse if this last bottleneck hadn't happened. And that's due to human activity, which is something we can control. So when you're thinking about, when you're voting and voting for people who make policy, keep these things in mind, that human activity can have huge effects on the organisms around us. Okay. Spiel over. Now we're going back to evolution in populations. So natural selection, again, is going to help adapt a population to its environment. And the combination of alleles, having a greater combination, is going to be more helpful in the population. Alleles that are most beneficial are going to be the ones that are going to increase over time. And that's natural selection. Nature chooses the best traits. And there are going to be 3 different types of selection we're going to talk about within a population. So allelic frequency in a population's gene pool are going to change over generations due to natural selection. And the way that nature selects what is best is going to depend on many things. And there are 3 different types of selection we're going to talk about. The first is stabilizing selection. We're going to give examples of these. Second is directional selection. Oof, I cannot spell at all today. And the last is disruptive selection. So we're going to start with stabilizing selection. So stabilizing selection is going to be selection that favors an average phenotype of individual in a population. So here's an example. One example is going to be the leg length in rabbits. So rabbits with shorter legs are too slow to sprint away from predators. So if you're a rabbit and your legs are too short, then you're going to be too slow to run away from predators. Rabbits with long legs can't turn sharp corners to evade predators, and therefore they can't take cover easily. However, rabbits with legs in the middle, mid-sized legs, are able to do both. They're able to run really quickly and turn sharp corners to evade predators. Therefore, middle length or mid-sized legs are going to be the most beneficial. So when we're looking at the graph here, this side would be short legs. This side would be long legs. And this would be mid-sized legs. And if you're a rabbit, having middle-sized legs is going to be best. Therefore, the selection is going to be for a phenotype in the middle. So it would be stabilizing selection. Directional selection is going to favor one extreme, so only one of the extremes. So an example of this would be that of a woodpecker. Woodpeckers feed on insects deep inside of trees. So only those that have really long beaks can actually reach the insects really far into a tree. Therefore, in our graph, this is going to be a short beak. And this over here is going to be a long beak. And in this case, the trend is going to be to select for a longer beak. Woodpeckers with the longer beak are going to be more beneficial. So instead of being in the middle, there's going to be more woodpeckers selected to have a long beak because having a long beak is the most beneficial. So in these graphs, it's showing in the darker shaded region here, it's showing how many organisms have each size beak. So there's very few with a small beak. There's some with a middle-sized beak, but there's many, many more with a long beak. So it's favoring the longer beak. And our last one is disruptive selection. And disruption selection favors individuals with either extreme. So either extreme is beneficial, but being in the middle is not. So an example of this would be the size of clams. So in clams, if you're small clam, if you're a small clam, you're really, really hard to find. So predators can't find you to eat you. And if you're a large clam, they can find you, but they can't open you. So you're too big to be opened, so you're safe. But if you're a middle-sized clam, they can find you and they can eat you. So it's not beneficial to be a middle-sized clam. Therefore, most clams are going to be small or large, but rarely in the middle. So those are the different types of selection that are going to happen over time. You could be favored to have a middle phenotype if a middle phenotype is most beneficial. That's stabilizing selection. You could be favored to have one extreme phenotype if having an extreme phenotype is favorable. That's directional selection. And then if you are going to be either of the two extremes, that is disruptive selection, depending on what's most beneficial. Okay, there's going to be some practice on this on camera.